Shade is one of the newest epic brawlers in the game right now, but he was overshadowed really hard by the subsequent Christmas update, which dropped the week after his release, and that update brought about a bunch of huge changes to brawler balancing, new hyperchargers, and even a newer, shinier toy, Buzz Lightyear, who was free to unlock, free to max out, and absolutely meta-defining, which led to him terrorizing the game's trophy ladder. So unfortunately, Shade pretty much disappeared from a lot of people's minds, which is kind of fitting for a forgotten and lonely ghost. But that won't stop us from continuing this video series of doing a 1v1 with Shade against every brawler in the game, because we still need to figure out how strong was Shade on release, and how does he compare to the past few brawler releases? Is he broken, mid, or somewhere in between? Did Supercell finally cook a balanced brawler on release? That's what we'll find out today. As a quick refresher on his kit, Shade is an assassin with a very fast movement speed and has two different traits, giving him an auto-charging super circle like Cordelius and Buzz, and letting him walk on water. He has 7,000 HP, and his attacks make him wind up before clapping his hands like how I did to your mom's cheeks last night. The attack deals 1600 damage normally and goes through walls, but if he hits an enemy in the middle of the attack, it'll deal double damage, meaning this brawler can potentially deal a ton of damage, although he needs a combination of decent aim and movement to pull it off. Shade supercharges in 4 hits regardless of whether the attack deals double damage, and when used gives him a short dash, a big movement speed boost, and also lets him pass through walls for 6 seconds, which is pretty huge. Passing through walls is inherently strong, since it means Shade can camp inside a wall to hit enemies while they can't hit him back. Depending on your brawler, hitting a Shade with super on a map with a lot of walls is basically impossible, and he can be extremely difficult to deal with since most brawlers that can shoot through walls are throwers, which Shade counters with his attack and super. Also, there are a few interesting interactions between Shade's attack and his super, because supers in Brawl Stars generally interrupt brawler attacks when used during their attack animation. But in Shade's case, if you use your super to interrupt your attack as it winds up, the rest of the attack will still come out after your dash from the super ends, meaning you could potentially wind up most of your attack and then dash to get the damage immediately after. Not only that, but there's a window of a few frames where if you dash right as your attack comes out, your attack will come out twice, once before you dash and once after, and this can potentially increase your burst damage combo if you do it right, but the timing is really hard and takes a lot of practice to pull off consistently. Lower end devices might not even be able to pull this off at all. Now, on its own, this attack doubling with the super might seem pretty limited in its use, since normally you'd want to use your super to close the gap on someone, and to do this tech you need to already be close enough to someone to hit them before you use your super if you want to land both attacks. But this tech is actually more useful than it seems because it has an additional interaction with one of Shade's gadgets. Before we talk about his gadgets though, let's quickly go over his star powers. Shade's first star power gives him a slight movement speed buff for 1 second if he hits someone for double damage with the middle of his attack, and his second star power gives him a 30% shield for the entire duration of his super. The second one is just better since the movement speed boost doesn't last long enough to really make plays with it, and it only benefits you once you've already closed the gap on someone, whereas the shield star power gives Shade an effective health pool of 9,100, which will help him close the gap onto enemies easier. Ideally with Shade, you're cycling his supers as much as possible anyways to get max value from his wall peeking, so the shield should provide a lot more consistent value throughout the course of the game as well. For Shade's gadgets, the first increases the range of his next attack by 50%, and the second slows enemies around him in the radius of a Poco healing gadget for 4 seconds. At first, a 4-second slow sounds pretty significant, but the slowing effect is actually kind of trash. It's not as good as other slows, and the range on it isn't as long as Shade's regular attack either, meaning that even if the slow was pretty good, it still wouldn't help for engaging onto enemies, and would be more just for fucking with someone once they're already in your range, and that's a lot less useful than a gadget that can increase the range of your attack to help close the gap onto enemies, especially for an assassin brawler. On top of that, this first gadget has a really cool interaction with the super attack doubling that I mentioned before, and I cover these gadget tricks a lot more in these videos, but basically you can use your super to get 2 gadget attacks out of a single use, letting you attack someone far away twice instead of just once. But that's not all. Shade can actually double his uses of this first gadget without using his super to begin with. If you attack and then gadget right before the attack comes out, you'll get a gadget attack but still have the gadget icon over your head, meaning you can get a second attack out of that one gadget use. People keep saying they patched this before its release, but that's not true. You can still do this, you might just have a skill issue since the timing is much harder than before. And both of these 2 gadget tricks can be combined to give you a 3 gadget attack out of 1 single gadget use, although this is really hard to pull off. Again, these techs are really tricky to do and also kind of situational, and most people with lower end devices might not be able to do them at all. But if you can practice to do at least one of these consistently, Shade can win a lot of 1v1s against brawlers he should otherwise lose to, which will come in very clutch in these 1v1s as you'll see me do. So now let's talk about the rules for these 1v1s. For the 1v1s, the game mode is knockout, and the map we're going with is Between the Rivers since it's a pretty balanced map with fairly open lanes while still having a few walls in key areas. It's just bushy enough to be pleasantly enjoyable but not too overcrowded. Just like any normal game, hypercharges, supers, gadgets, and gears are all allowed. On Shade I used this build, and my 1v1 partner Maverick could use whatever build he wanted. Since the game mode is knockout, there's going to be gas closing in on us over time, which means theoretically it's possible to just camp like a dick until the gas closes in, and then just jump on someone at the very end like a smelly nerd. I'm going to try not to do this since not every game mode is knockout or showdown, and this way the 1v1s will better simulate an actual game mode, but a lot of Shade 1v1s kinda went to the gas anyways just because of how difficult it is to close the gap on an enemy with Shade if you don't have his super. I did try my best though. The Brawler 1v1s are roughly going to be organized from worst to best versus Shade, so we'll start with the Brawlers that Shade counters the hardest and then end with the best Shade counters, and then we'll give Shade an on-release strength rating and place him on our tier list, rating his general strength and brokenness against the previous Brawler releases. With all that out of the way, let's begin the Brawler 1v1s. Starting with the throwers. Shade's kit is really well suited for eating throwers alive since most throwers are squishier brawlers that don't deal the most damage, and Shade is kind of a tankier brawler that can deal 3200 damage per slap, and his attacks and super make him go through walls. Thrower attacks are also generally really easy to dodge, especially for Shade who has a very fast movement speed, and after Shade wastes some of his opponent's ammo, he can go in when there's a gap in the thrower's attack spam. If Shade doesn't just kill the thrower outright, once he gets his supercharge, it's pretty much a guaranteed kill onto a thrower with the bonus movement speed and shield. This is also where Shade's first gadget that extends his range can be really useful because it helps Shade charge his first super, and this is going to become a lot more important in the later 1v1s where Shade would otherwise struggle to charge a first super at all. Overall, these 1v1s are nothing too special. Almost every thrower except one, which we'll talk about later, gets clapped in the dust. And for the first time in this short series, that pretty much ends the list of brawlers that I would say Shade has an overwhelmingly good matchup into. Don't get me wrong, this isn't to say that Shade is like weak, but I think the type of brawler he is means he doesn't usually take over the game and have these like unlosable matchups for him, right? Unless you're playing one of these 8 throwers, and even they can occasionally have moments where they might score a lucky kill since they can hit Shade through walls. So now let's move on to brawlers that Shade has a very good 1v1 matchup into, and these are going to be the low DPS brawlers like Squeak and Sandy. These brawlers all technically outrange Shade, so on more open maps with a very few walls, these matchups might go more in their favor, but their overall DPS is generally just too low to take out Shade before he squishes them into a pancake. That being said, some of them can still score kills on a Shade if they can play really well or if the Shade messes up, and these brawlers might do a lot better in 3v3 modes than they did in the 1v1 with the help of teammates. For example, Mr. P with his super penguins can help waste Shade's shots, so in a 3v3 setting it might be stronger since in the 1v1 Shade was just able to walk up and take out the spawner pretty easily even behind a wall. Gray too might be better in a 3v3 since his hook gadget can land on Shade even if he's sitting in or behind a wall, so with good pinching and timing from teammates that might be enough to take Shade out, or at least break open a lot of walls on the map for the benefit of Gray's teammates. Also, while Clancy is placed here as a pretty easy matchup for Shade because of his low DPS, Clancy really struggles in these quicker 1v1 formats since he doesn't have time to build up his level 3, and with his recent nerfs to his level 1 and 2 forms, he just doesn't feel the damage to take anyone out, let alone a Shade, unless the game goes on long enough for him to farm. Overall though, in the 1v1, these brawlers were pretty solid matchups for Shade. Next up in the good matchups for Shade, we have brawlers that get 2-tap. Now this kind of depends a lot on how good the Shade is, because landing that 3k shot every time takes a combination of both good aim and movement, since with the attack windup, if you dodge left or right and don't account for that with your aim, you won't land the double damage. This means that Shade inherently isn't the most consistent brawler, and is a part of the reason why he doesn't feel as overwhelming as some of the other brawler releases, just because he's hard to use effectively. Even with the help of a wall, in some of these matchups, Shade still occasionally went down just because he, or I guess, missed too many shots. And again, some brawlers will also do better in 3v3 modes with their abilities getting more value with teammates. Like Colt has that wall break super and gadget, Jesse has that turret with the slow, Bell has that damage mark, Byron has anti-heal, etc. Terra in particular I think could do much better against Shade in 3v3s than in this 1v1, since her super can pull Shade regardless of whether he's in a wall or not. It can also break those walls, and she does a lot of damage. Her biggest issue in this 1v1 was just that her super took too long to cycle against with just one brawler compared to like facing 3, right? Janet also recently got a hypercharge that makes her a lot better, but it came after this footage was recorded, so it won't be shown here, but her DPS is overall still too low to take out a Shade with super, and Shade can 2-shot Janet without shield gear, so it's probably still free for Shade. Cordelius was also a surprising matchup since he does outrange and also has that auto-charging super circle like Shade does, but most Cords don't run shield gear, so again he kind of just get 2 shots by Shade. The Shadow Realm also doesn't really help Cord if he uses it while Shade is in his super, since Shade has a movement speed boost in his super too. Kit is an interesting case because I actually think he would do a lot better in a 3v3 as well. I recently found out that if a Kit supers a Shade while Shade is inside a wall, the Shade will get stunned, but Kit will be free to move and attack, which is a pretty fascinating interaction. If Kit can land a super on a Shade at all, and I think Shade will lose that most of the time with Kit's teammates there to help, but Shade can also just 2-tap Kit and will outrange him with the help of his gadget, so in the 1v1 he still places here. Overall, these brawlers do have more of a fighting chance than the previous ones covered, but I'd say they're still just good matchups for Shade if you can hit your shots, which will be a common theme in this video. It all kind of depends on whether or not the Shade can hit his shots. And that's particularly true for this next section, which are brawlers that are more tanky, so they don't just get 2-shot by Shade, but they still generally lose in the 1v1 with enough well-placed claps. For brawlers like Bull and Daryl, if Shade just saves a super to dodge the opponent's supers, they really struggle to lock Shade down to take him out, and Shade can whittle them down easily enough since he doesn't get outranged. 8-Bit and Pam also just struggle in general to hit their shots, especially on a mobile brawler like Shade since their unload speeds are a little slower, plus Shade can also just sit in a wall to become untargetable. BB swings have a pretty similar shot delay and range to Shade's claps, but Shade's superior shield duration and movement speed buff and damage helps him get the win in this 1v1, especially with the help of wiggling in walls and use of his gadget. Buster's super unfortunately doesn't block melee attacks, and with Shade's effective health of over 9,000, Buster struggles to take Shade out with 3 attacks, and his reload speed is kinda slow. If Buster can land the pull on Shade though, and Shade doesn't have his super, then Buster can potentially take Shade out, but it's pretty hard. Chuck is a meme brawler who isn't really built for 1v1s, especially in this format. By the time he gets his post down, Shade has his super, and Chuck's train form is so choreographed it's easy to hit him as a Shade if you know where he'll land. Melody's notes are generally hard to hit on a mobile brawler like Shade, although she can win with super if she has hers and Shade doesn't have his. That being said, Shade cycles his super faster than Melody can, especially if Shade is sitting in a wall and Melody can't hit Shade at all. Lily surprisingly loses to Shade in the 1v1 as well, which is in big part thanks to Shade's auto-charging super circle, which helps locate a Lily sneaking around in the grass after using her gadget. Plus, Shade with his shield is too much HP for Lily to take down with her damage burst combo, and Shade also outranges Lily and outspeeds, so he pretty much always gets his super before Lily does. And in a controversial twist, I also place Hank here as a good matchup for Shade. I know, Bedlam, what the fuck are you smoking? Hank is obviously the best Shade counter, but I will caveat this with 2 big statements. 1, this is before Hank's recent tank trait buff, which might have helped him a lot more here in the 1v1, maybe, but not really. The bigger thing is, too, in a 1v1, I think Hank struggles against Shade a lot more than Hank does in 3v3 because Hank just isn't really a 1v1 brawler. Hank's attacks have too much downtime in between bubbles to exert consistent pressure and keep enemies spaced away, especially since unlike the other charging brawler Angelo, uncharged bubbles have no range, so there's no threat of consistent damage at Hank's theoretical max range, whereas Angelo can always at least poke at max distance to prevent enemies from healing. And unlike Janet, Hank has to choose between charging bubbles and healing if he gets low, which makes Hank lose even more pressure and map control in the 1v1. Plus, Hank's bubbles pop automatically, so it's pretty easy to just go in on a Hank in between his attacks after they run out, which again contrasts Angelo, who can just hold a max charge shot until the heat death of the universe. Now, if you have teammates that can back up a Hank and cover for him in this downtime where his bubbles are charging or when he's healing, yeah, maybe he does do really good against the Shade since Hank has a lot of HP and can hit Shade through walls or slow him. But in a 1v1, Shade was able to get his super pretty easily against a Hank, but just by playing patiently, and since Hank struggled to finish Shade off even if he did get Shade pretty low, it was basically over for Hank. Sorry to you Hank mains, but unfortunately all of these tankier brawlers are overall still good matchups for Shade in the 1v1. But what about brawlers with higher HP who can also outrange Shade with decent DPS? Well, Shade doesn't necessarily lose the 1v1 against some of those brawlers either, so long as Shade has good movement and can charge his super. For example, brawlers like Carl, Gus, Bonnie, Nani, Mandy, Maisie, and Angelo aren't really able to prevent Shade from getting his first super, and once Shade has a super, it's really hard to hit shots on a Shade thanks to his consistent movement speed boost and wall peeking. Shade was able to play around walls to juke out Carl pickaxes, evade Gus's shots to prevent him from charging his ghost pop, slip through Nani's and Maisie's difficult to hit shots, and dodge past or even just tank Mandy's and Angelo's attacks with the help of his shield star power. Other brawlers that live a 2-tap from Shade but struggle to hit shots are multi-shot brawlers like Bo, Pearl, Griff, Gale, Lola, Eve, and Otis. Bo's shots are notoriously hard to hit, and for Shade it's pretty easy to juke them out. Griff struggled a lot to hit shots in the 1v1, but it's possible that Maverick isn't that great of a Griff for whatever reason. I feel like personally Griff has a lot more potential here in the 3v3s if he can open up the map with his wall break gadget, especially with the help of his super damage buff, but in this 1v1 he didn't do that good. Gale's super can't stun Shade against the wall if Shade has his super, since Shade will just pass through the wall, so Gale doesn't work as a counter unfortunately and dies. Lola and Eve don't have any ways to hit Shade through a wall, so they just get cooked. Pearl's attacks suffer a lot against a brawler like Shade's, because being able to spam out shots is pretty important since Shade relies so much on making his opponents waste their attacks on a wall, but Pearl can't really spam out shots without wasting her heat bar and shield star power, so she plays a lot more passively into Shade, which makes her easier to take space on and kill. Otis too suffers from the multi-shot issue. Although he is supposed to be a tank counter, he kinda just dies to Shade up close anyways because his mute won't interrupt Shade's attack once his animation has already started, kinda like how it works against brawlers like BB and Frank and Buzz Lightyear. As long as Shade jukes some of the projectiles in each ammo, he can just 3-shot Otis, and if he gets muted he can potentially just run away too through the walls as well. These brawlers would definitely all do a lot better against Shade on a super open map instead of a balanced map, but to be honest, this map is still fairly open. It's just that if Shade can get a super and there's any walls at all, Shade can use a super to get a speed boost and a dash to help close the gap on those open maps, so long as he can get that first super. And in a similar vein, there are a couple assassins who also rely on getting their first super and then cycling it, but lose to Shade. Leon's all about poking from range to get his first invis and then cycling it against his opponents, but even if he is invisible, he'll easily get detected by Shade's supercharged circle, which ruins that element of surprise. Plus, Leon has no way to hit a Shade inside a wall, so if Shade gets a super, it's pretty much over for Leon. Edgar gets his super automatically and can not only out DPS Shade up close, but also live 2 max damage shots from Shade, especially with the help of that shield gadget, but he unfortunately gets outranged by Shade and again can't hit Shade once he's in a wall. So tallying it up, so far we've covered 52 brawlers out of 86 in the game, which Shade has a generally winning 1v1 matchup into, and at the end I'll place Shade on our tier list comparing this to other brawler releases. But for now, let's move on to some of Shade's more 50-50 neutral matchups, because there are a few really surprising ones in here, starting off with Poco, B, and Jean. Now for most of these 50-50 neutral matchups, because these brawlers outrange Shade, by the time Shade gets close they'll usually have their super and will have whittled Shade's health down low enough for Shade to not really be able to push in anymore without risking dying. Also, in the case of these 3 brawlers, they have abilities that let them hit Shade through walls, which can be pretty dangerous for Shade since he won't be able to run away as convincingly if he gets low. Poco with his gadget and super healing makes it so it'll take more than 4 hits for Shade to take Poco out, which takes Shade a pretty long time to pull off, and Poco can take Shade out with 5 hits, which doesn't take that long for Poco to fart out against the Shade, especially with his longer range. B might seem like she'd get clapped pretty easily by Shade up close, but with her honeycomb star powered, it actually takes more than 2 hits to take B out, even with max damage shots for Shade, and B's reload speed and high damage across all ranges means it's really hard for Shade to close the gap on her as well, and if he gets caught by B's super, then there's a good chance he'll go down. Plus, B can use her gadget that goes through walls to finish off a Shade that gets low. Jean with his Spirit Slap Star power can 3-shot Shade, and he has a gadget that will knock Shade back as well to interrupt his attacks. Jean's long range also feels really scary to play against as a Shade because it means Shade will need to feed Jean his super to close the gap, or even risk dying by getting whittled down from range. Now against this trio, if Shade can get a super, it's still a win for him, and in these 1v1s I did ultimately win with Shade in the best of 3, but it was really close and I don't think it's enough to definitively say it favors Shade by much, if at all. Max, Nita, and Ashe are also brawlers that outrange Shade, but they don't have abilities that can hit Shade through walls to catch him when he's low. That being said, Max does have that dash gadget which lets her dodge her Shade shot, and she has a higher movement speed than Shade does with his super, which also makes it hard for Shade to hit shots on her, but her shots are still pretty hard to hit on Shade, and Shade's shots are a little more forgiving even if you don't land the max damage, and he has that damage reduction shield, so in the end it's still pretty close. Nita's range advantage against Shade helps her a lot in the 1v1, letting her cycle her bear before Shade can get a super. Plus her reload speed is really fast, so even though it takes 4 hits to kill a Shade, it still happens pretty quickly, and her bear stun will interrupt Shade's attack and make it easier to take him out. Shade's main advantage is just that he can attack Nita through her bear and through walls, which means if he has a super he can potentially still win that. Ashe shots are kind of similar to Shade since he also has that wind up with his attack and potentially deals 3200 damage per hit, but Ashe's range is longer and Ashe has a lot more HP combined with a healing gadget. Shade though has a faster movement speed with his super and also a shield and can attack through walls, which makes it hard for Ashe to hit shots since his attacks already have a delay on them. This footage was recorded before Ashe got his hypercharge, so it might favor Ashe slightly more now, but on release this was a pretty even 1v1 between 2 pretty similar brawlers in their mechanics and kit. It all comes down to who can hit more shots and dodge more shots. The next few brawlers with even matchups don't have much in common. Miko is a brawler that's just inherently pretty bullshit, and for a brawler with a delay on his attack like Shade, it's really hard to time hitting Miko when he lands without some practice. If Miko can jump on a Shade without a super, either with his super or ammo stealing star power, Miko wins that interaction most of the time, but if Shade has a super, then the movement speed makes it really hard for Miko to hit him, plus if Shade can get on the water or in a wall, then it'll be impossible for Miko to hit Shade at all. Chester's matchup into Shade is pretty random, which is true to his identity as the RNG brawler. If Chester can get a bomb super or stun super, he can win. If Chester doesn't, then he'll lose. Kenji is a pretty mobile brawler, which makes it harder for Shade to hit consistent 3k shots on him, but likewise, Shade is also a pretty mobile brawler and has a shield, which makes it hard for Kenji to heal from damaging Shade. Kenji does have a heal gadget and the shield star power to eat a couple of Shade's hits, but Shade can also just run away through a wall if he gets in a pinch. Overall, it kind of depends on who can land their attacks, and in Kenji's case, super is better. And lastly, for the even matchups, we have Shade himself. The big decider in the Shade 1v1 is really just movement and aim. If you lose in a Shade 1v1, you probably got diffed and the enemy Shade hit more 3k shots than you did. The gadget and super techs can make up for small differences though, and in a team-based setting there might be an added layer of positioning too, where you want to make sure you're not in the open getting pinched by the enemy's teammates, but in the 1v1 setting it's really just aim and movement, nothing too crazy. And with that, we've covered 10 brawlers with a neutral matchup, making 61 brawlers out of 86 in the game that don't have a winning matchup into Shade. A far cry from the 2 previous brawler releases. But let's now take a look at Shade's losing matchups, starting with his losing but still winnable ones. Most of these brawlers will outrange Shade and have a pretty spammable attack, which means these brawlers will almost always have their super ready, while Shade will be stuck struggling to close the gap and charge his first super at all. For example, in the Shelly 1v1, Shelly naturally just outranges Shade, which lets her farm her super pretty quickly and reliably against the Shade, and that Shelly super against Shade is deadly. With the slow star power and clay pigeons, Shelly can quickly burst Shade down even through a wall, not to mention the super itself will interrupt Shade's attacks if he gets too close as well. Shade with super can still potentially kill Shelly if he doesn't feed her super, but this is generally a pretty good matchup for Shelly. Piper is a very surprising placement for me personally on here, but the main reason she makes this spot is just because of her knockback gadget, which can prevent Shade from closing the gap on her and killing her up close. Plus, Piper does kind of an insane amount of damage even at medium range, 3 or 4 shotting Shade, which isn't even that bad considering she has a star power that reloads her ammo when she gets hits. Her super can also open up the map, making it worse for Shade as the game goes on. Obviously, Shade can potentially 2-shot Piper, but it's a lot harder than it seems even on a balanced map. Ems is a brawler that I don't think is really going to perform in a 3v3 setting like how she did in the 1v1, but at least in the 1v1 she did do pretty good. Ems was able to zone out Shade by spamming shots and preventing him from getting his super, which means Ems always had a reliable slow that would hit Shade even through walls, and he couldn't really close the gap on her without just dying in the process. Ems also has that gadget pushback and hypercharge pushback, so she did pretty good, although in a 3v3 Shade will probably get his super a lot easier. Ruffs is another pretty surprising placement, at least to me, but I don't know what it was. Maverick was just tapping my ghost booty for the whole 1v1 duration. Bro did not miss on the Ruffs, and Ruffs has a pretty fast reload speed too, so he could just spam shots, preventing Shade from getting his first super for most of the game. Ruffs also has a knockback and wall break on his super, and a pretty wide range knockback on his gadget, which he can kind of just spam out, so Ruffs did pretty good here in these 1v1s against Shade. Colette, similar to Ruffs, also has a very spammable attack which outranges Shade, and with her healing gadget, this made her really hard to burst through. Plus, with her knockback star power combined with her hypercharge, which cycles kinda quickly, she can definitely kill a Shade who's stuck without a super. Crow is yet again a brawler with a spammable attack that outranges Shade, which means yet again, Shade won't get a super while Crow will. Both of Crow's gadgets also fuck with Shade a lot, either by slowing him down or shielding Crow to let him eat an additional hit. Matchups like this though is where the double gadget tech can come in super clutch. If you can get 2 gadget attacks off on a Crow in quick succession, you can win by quickly 2-tapping the Crow, and this will help you get your super. But if Crow jumps your attack or shields it, then you might still lose with Shade. Meg kind of fell off after her damage nerfs coming after her rework, but she still shreds Shade up close and in that mid-range with the help of her swipe in mech form, which means Shade kind of gets beaten at his own damage range since it takes him so many hits to fully kill a Meg. Plus, Meg also has that explosion damage, which deals a couple thousand damage, and her baby form, which can get off another bonus 1000, 2000 damage, which means Shade kinda loses this most of the time unless he can get his super and space perfectly. Draco generally has too much HP and just enough damage to kill Shade by the time Draco's last stand gadget runs out, and this is true regardless of if Draco's in dragon form or not, so he does pretty well into Shade overall. Against all these brawlers, if Shade can get his super and can play perfectly around walls to dodge shots while hitting his opponent for max damage every time, he can win, so these aren't the hardest counters ever, but Shade just gets his super too inconsistently to rely on, and his attacks generally are also kind of hard to consistently land as well for max damage, so these matchups are still really tough for Shade overall, especially in the heat of a 3v3 fight. And now, this brings us to the brawlers that I would say do really good into Shade. We covered brawlers with good movement like Max and Kenji, but brawlers like Stu have a much more accessible movement ability than Max does, and has higher damage at longer range than Kenji does, and this makes him do really well into Shade, who needs to predict where Stu is going to stop after his dash to land his shots for max damage, and that is honestly way too hard. Stu's gas to heal star power also means Shade really struggles to finish Stu off, and Stu also has a wall break gadget which can open up the map and prevent Shade from hiding as easily. Mortis also has a dash like Stu, which makes him really difficult to consistently hit for Shade, and Mortis can also run down a Shade using his gadget to just kill him before Shade gets his super. Mortis' super can also go through walls, which can help finish Shade off, and he can also run away if he gets low since Shade's range is too short to catch Mortis most of the time. Overall, these brawlers do really good in a Shade, which is unfortunate for Shade since both are pretty strong in this meta right now. Working off of brawlers that have a better movement than the ones previously covered, these next few brawlers all have better range, damage, and spammier shots than the ones previously covered, which helped them do really well against Shade in the 1v1. Starting with Mo. Again, this footage was recorded before Mo's viability got nuked off the face of the earth with his cataclysmic reload speed, super damage, and super charge rate nerfs, but On Shade's release, Mo did beat Shade really hard in the 1v1 since Mo is, or was, Mo, and his super killed everyone, and his attack just randomly did a bullshit amount of damage that would two-shot you regardless of your HP. An added bonus with Mo is that his super also goes through walls, and with the wall break gadget, can break walls open to expose Shade's soft interior to the world. These days though, this matchup might be a lot better for Shade, and maybe the rat can sink deeper into obscurity so we can all stop thinking about this pest going forward. Willow is the only thrower in the game who doesn't just auto-lose to Shade, but not only that, she also happens to have a really good matchup into Shade in the 1v1, believe it or not. If Shade doesn't have his shield active, Willow will 3-shot Shade since each Willow attack does 2400 damage, and she also outranges Shade and can spam her attacks out, meaning Shade really struggles to approach her for a hug. Plus, if you think Shade can just walk up and kill her before her poison kills him, Willow can just use her dive gadget to disappear for 3 seconds and guarantee Shade's death. Willow also has her super to bail her out in bad situations, and in game modes with the poison, this can be used to make brawlers kill themselves by inhaling too much stinky fart gas. Since her super was also recently made to be a lot girthier, she could low-key be pretty underrated against Shade, the only thrower to achieve this title. Charlie was deceptively tanky even before her recent health buff thanks to the help of her cocoon gadget, and she naturally doesn't get 2-shot by Shade either, which is a big bonus. She's able to spam out her attacks, which deals a lot more DPS up close, and her super can also interrupt Shade's attack and give her time to heal, which is really solid in the 1v1. Her hypercharge also boosts her damage and helps her take Shade out faster. Overall, a great matchup for Charlie. Surge during Shade's release was one of the strongest tank counters in the game, and against Shade this was no exception, with his jump able to dodge a Shade attack while also potentially knocking Shade back and hitting him for damage, and Surge's high damage attacks and reload gadget allowing him to shred Shade's shirt to shit. Surge also has a longer range than Shade and had enough HP to not get too tapped by Shade, but this has changed recently with Surge's HP nerf making him too tappable for Shade. This does make him less good into Shade now, but still probably winning for Surge overall if you take into account his range. And for the last stretch of brawlers that have a great matchup into Shade, before we get into his hardest counters, we have tanky brawlers that Shade can't really kill. Starting with Rosa. Rosa has so much HP, especially with her shield plus hypercharge, and her range is long enough to pretty much match Shade's and box him out comfortably. Just a classic case of a tank having too much HP for an assassin to deal with. Sam has his glove healing, which supplements his already decent high HP, and this makes him really hard for Shade to kill as well, since Sam also has a fast movement speed when he drops his gloves. Sam is one of those weird brawlers that just spams his gloves at a wall the whole game and somehow wins at the end, and against Shade, Sam can do that a lot too, using his glove combos to burst Shade down, and even using his gadget to suck Shade out of the wall to finish him off. Any brawler with a suck or stun or slow, like Rosa and Sam, do pretty good into Shade, and Buzz is no exception to this either, with an auto-charging super circle that lets him get his super for free against the Shade, and even if Shade has his super, if Buzz can land that stun on Shade, it's still a kill for Buzz most of the time, since Buzz has a lot of HP and damage as well. Buzz does have to use his extra stun duration star power though to lock in that kill, but this is still a great matchup for Buzz. Fang is also a brawler with a lot of HP, damage, and a stun, and he also kind of outranges Shade with his shoes and super. If Shade uses that super attack, stun attack combo, he'll basically shred a Shade into nothing while interrupting Shade's attack in the process. A pretty great matchup for Fang. Against all these brawlers with a great matchup into Shade, I think Shade can occasionally pull out the win if the map has enough walls and if he can get a super quickly enough, since wall peeking is so inherently strong. But in general, balanced map, all else equal, I think Shade loses these majority of the time, and if you see a Shade, maybe consider going with some of these brawlers. Especially these next 6 brawlers, which are the top 6 best Shade counters. I really don't see how a Shade would win these matchups normally unless the opponent is a literal troll, so you'll probably still see your teammates playing these brawlers into a Shade and losing these matchups, but that's to be expected. Either way, let's get into the top 6 brawlers, starting with El Pablo. Mr. Pablo has quite a few tricks up his sleeve to take Shade out, with both of his gadgets able to interrupt Shade's attack and the meteor one being able to break walls and open up the map. His super can also be used to interrupt Shade's attack and hit Shade through walls, and he naturally has one of the highest health pools in the game, which means it's really hard for a Shade to kill a Primo with decent movement. Overall, Primo should basically always win against the Shade. And coming in at number 5 for the best Shade counter, we have Lu. By the way, this placement is based on the 1v1 we did before Lu got a 15% reload speed buff, which is absolutely vile on a brawler like this with so much CC in his kit. Lu outranges Shade and charges his super pretty quickly, and once he gets his super, Shade is basically fucked since Lu's freeze will interrupt Shade's attack, and Shade won't be able to move as well standing in Lu's dandruff zone. Lu's super also affects Shade through walls, and he has a star power which reduces the enemy's damage depending on how much their freeze bar is filled, which completely cucks Shade since he only barely 2-shots Lu normally, if he lands max damage attacks. Lu does a pretty hefty chunk of damage per ammo as well, so overall this makes Lu just an absolute hard counter to Shade, and probably most tanks and assassins in general right now, so definitely keep an eye on the Lu pick going forward. Next up, landing in number 4, we have Douglas. Shade technically outranges the Wiener's attack, but to be honest, with the delay on the clap, it's really hard to actually feel this range advantage, and most of the time Doug will just walk up and splash his backwash directly onto your face, which goes through walls and does a pretty hefty amount of damage. Doug also has a lot of HP like El Primo, and once he gets his super he won't die, so what do you know, Doug actually does really well against brawlers that can't consistently outrange him, of which there are very few, but they do exist. Congrats on the high placement, Doug, and let's move on to number 3. We have RT, which is basically just Doug again, but better. RT in his split form has that shield with his star power, which helps him stay alive, and his circle attacks deal significantly more damage than Doug's, which means that Shade just gets eaten alive by the head and ass of RT's incredible technique. RT also has a sniper's range in his base form, and he does a lot of damage too regardless of the form he's in. RT is one of the best tank counters in the game, and he definitely fulfills that role against Shade. And in number 2, what do you know it? It's actually just Doug again. We have Jackie. Jackie has a really high HP, she's the OG circle attacking brawler, and her super will suck Shade through walls and interrupt his attacks if he's hiding in there, and she has a star power which reflects a portion of the damage back onto Shade, which is really strong since Shade needs to be in range of that star power to deal any damage to Jackie at all. Jackie is the OG no-aim brawler, and she pulls it off better than the other two can, that countering Shade. If you are playing Shade and see a Jackie on the enemy team, do not ever try this matchup. Jackie's drill will dig into you, no questions asked. And finally, in the number 1 spot for the best Shade counter, it's Frank. Frank is what Hank kinda wishes he was, with an attack that actually consistently has decent range and way more DPS. Frank just completely shreds Shade if Shade can somehow bring a Frank to a low enough HP to begin with. And that's pretty hard because Frank has so much HP and outranges Shade, so Shade struggles to land any hits at all against a good Frank that's spacing well. Frank also has that pull gadget which will interrupt Shade's attack and suck him in too to get smashed, and Frank's super will stun Shade through walls while breaking them in the process, making Frank Shade's natural enemy, more so than Hank is. Frank's damage is just too high, his range is too long, and his HP is too thick for Shade to ever hope to kill a Frank on his own. Again, if you see this brawler on the enemy team as a Shade, do not try this matchup, he will shove his giant hammer up your butt. And there you have it, every brawler 1v1 against Shade, ordered vaguely on how good they do, although within each tier it might not really be in order. So now that we've covered every single brawler 1v1 against Shade, how does he place compared to the previous recent brawler releases? Well, going back to my previous 1v1 videos, I made 2 tier lists based on the 1v1s to rate how strong a brawler is on release, the broken and bullshit tier list and the general strength tier list. For the general strength tier list, F tier has a winning matchup into absolutely none of the brawlers in the game, and S tier has a winning matchup into more than 80% of brawlers in the game. Based on these 1v1s, Shade had a winning matchup into 52 out of 86 brawlers in the game, or about 60.5% of brawlers, placing him in the A tier of general strength, which is to say that he's generally strong against most things, but it's kind of on the border and he definitely has his fair share of bad matchups. But you will notice that Kenji had a very similar number of winning matchups on his release, and he felt so strong that he had to be nerfed a bunch of times afterwards until they recently kind of killed his reload speed. Why doesn't Shade feel this broken, and why don't you see him everywhere? Well, a part of the answer lies in this next tier list, the broken and bullshit tier list. For the broken and bullshit tier list, it's the same as the previous one but based on overwhelmingly good matchups instead. Shade had an overwhelmingly good matchup into just 8 out of 86 brawlers in the game, or about 9.3% of brawlers, and this places him in the D tier of broken and bullshit. That's not too impressive for an assassin release, to be honest. For context, Kenji, another assassin, beat 42 of the 84 brawlers in the game in overwhelmingly good fashion, so Kenji had to really fuck it up to lose, and that is 50% of the brawlers in the game at the time. Even though both Kenji and Shade have similar levels of good matchups, Kenji beat the vast majority of those good matchups overwhelmingly. Shade only beat the throwers in that same way, and he couldn't even beat all of them. And I think that's honestly fine. I mean, you don't really see people complaining about Shade breaking the game or anything, or calling for him to get a bunch of emergency nerfs. After his release, not too many people really complained about Shade at all, because the thing is, even though Shade is generally pretty strong, the big issue is he's kind of inherently inconsistent since he takes good movement and aim to utilize effectively. Not only that, but with the gadget and super text that you can do, and in some cases need to do in order to beat certain matchups, Shade takes a lot of skill to play well. And while Kenji took a lot of skill too, with Kenji you could just auto-aim down all the brawlers he had a free matchup and do pretty easily and still win. Shade, you can't really auto-aim with this brawler to great success, and he doesn't even reliably beat any type of brawler except throwers, so in a draft format in ranked you might not see him all that often, especially since he is fairly counterable. If you wanted to counter throwers in ranked, there are other options which are just as good into throwers but also do more and fulfill other niches and roles as well, like Mortis, Melody, Lily, Daryl, Gray, Carl, Stu, etc. And not to constantly compare Shade to Kenji, but even against his bad matchups with Kenji, you could honestly win those matchups if you played really well and landed your supers. Shade, on the other hand, against his bad matchups, he doesn't have that same kind of control over the outcome. You only really beat a bad matchup for Shade if the opponent messes up or if you hit a perfect gadget super tech combo, and that's way harder than just landing a simple Kenji super. Overall, I'd say Shade is fairly balanced, potentially on the strong side if you can dedicate yourself to learning him well. Having a good matchup into most of the brawlers in the game is by no means bad and shows he has some potential. But I think because of a combination of other brawlers filling his role better, him being more difficult to play, and new toy syndrome right now overshadowing him with a certain buzzard brawler that's currently taking over ladder and happens to do pretty well in the Shade, Shade has unfortunately fallen by the wayside and will be forgotten unless Brawl Stars decides to buff him, which they probably won't just because he's only an epic brawler. And what do I think? Is Shade worth upgrading? Should you be afraid of him? Honestly, not really. He has a lot of great counters, and unless you find him cute or fun to play, you can reasonably just skip this one. There are better assassins out there, which I mentioned earlier. Anyways, that's going to be it for me. A special thank you to my tier 2 and 3 subs. You help make videos like these possible. I love you so much. Shoutouts to Maverick for helping me with these 1v1s. He's the GOAT. Join my Discord, link is in the description. I don't have a creator code, and people keep asking for one, I don't have one. But if you subscribe and drop a big like on the vid, maybe one day it'll happen. Pray for your boy. And finally, if you made it this far into the video, I just want to say I love your top today. It looks absolutely fabulous and very comfortable. Keep that thing around for the cold winter ahead. Take care of yourselves, guys. I love you. Goodbye. Peace.